Well, good evening. I'm your host, Robert Wilson, with Cowboy Wisdom Unleashed. 7 ways why my inherited nervous system, ego, created my museum mind obedient stubbornness. The inherited nervous system, ego, equates obedience with survival. Your lineage survived by obeying fear, hierarchy, and caution. That reflex passed forward, and your ego now treats obedience as the safest path through life. The museum mind freezes those inherited obedience patterns into permanent exhibits. Where do you see that in your life? I still see it in mine, but I'm getting more relaxed about rising out of it. Forcing you to follow the old rules even when they shrink your instinct. This becomes the stubborn, obedient Huskow's jail. As a frontier lockup where you obey ghosts instead of veracity. Because the inherited nervous system's ego uses stubbornness to avoid emotional risks. Stubbornness becomes the ego's shield, a way to avoid vulnerability, uncertainty, and expansion. When your nervous system feels threatened, the ego digs in, insisting this is how it is. Have you ever done that? My ego has, still does. But the thing about it now is being awakened and aware of it to rise out of it. The ego dips in insisting this is how it is. I must stay in control. The museum mind preserves these rigid stances as identity exhibits, trapping you in reenactments instead of perception. That's a Huskow, a jail where stubborn obedience keeps you from your own frontier. The inherited nervous system, ego, fears change more than confinement. And that is what we do here is I'm always forgetting something. There, and now I'm all dressed up and ready to go uptown. As fears change more than confinement, change dissolves the familiar. The ego hates that. So it invents a stubborn, obedient persona to keep you inside predictable emotional territory. And if you take change out of your life and use the word expand, it expands you out of it. That scares the ego all the well. The museum mind stores these familiar limits as truth, forcing you to obey them even when they restrict your sovereignty. This becomes the Huskow. Have you ever been thrown in the Huskow? Oh, yeah. But we throw ourselves in the Huskow through our museum minds, thinking and knowing and insecurities. A cell where you serve time for an inherited caution instead of instinctual expansion. Why my inherited nervous system ego invented my mind museum stubborn know-it-all ignorance. I've got a little bit of that. I got something to loan if somebody wants some. But it's really about understanding most of the stuff inside us is beyond the thinking known. It's in the mind museum. It's also in the inherited nervous system. Because your inherited nervous system, ego, mistakes ignorance for protection, and your lineage survived by clinging to familiar beliefs. Even then, they weren't true. That reflex passed forward, and your ego now treats lack of knowing as a safer than confronting a nowality. The museum of mind freezes those inherited blind spots into truth exhibits, and the ego forces you to obey them. This becomes a stubborn, ignorant Huskow a frontier lockup where outdated beliefs guard the door. Because your inherited nervous system, ego, uses know-it-all certainty to avoid expansion. As your nervous system feels threatened, the ego invents absolute answers for nothing, because there's never an answer or a solution. It's always the path of enlightenment. I already know I'm right. I don't need to hear anything else. Become emotional barricades. The Mind Museum preserves these rigid stances as identity, trapping you in reenactments instead of perception. That's the Huskow. That's a Huskow, a jail where certainty becomes a cage that blocks your frontier instincts. And that is what the nervous system ego does. It blocks your instincts. Because your inherited nervous system ego fears being wrong more than being confined. Being wrong threatens the ego's continuity. So it chooses confinement over growth. It builds a stubborn ignorance persona to keep you inside predictable mental territory. And that's something I'm going to have a podcast on mental, because the mental ain't all we think it is, because it's really a noisy operation. The museum mind stores these familiar limits as how life works, forcing you to obey them even when they shrink your sovereignty. How does your thinking and knowing and your mind museum and your keep you in the Huskow in a cell where you serve time for inherited fear of humility instead of instinctual expansion? And your why my inherited nervous system, my mind museum obedient habits hold me hostage. My inherited nervous system built a museum mind long before I ever had a choice. It collected my fear logic from ancestors' caution, from parents' correctness, from school emotional snapshots from childhood, and social obedience, emotional snapshots, obedience. We've been taught to be obedient to our comfort zone. From every room I walked through, it turned all of that into obedient habits that pretend to be me. These habits never protect my life, they protect my past. And that's mostly what the ego does, is protect your past. We protect our past emphatically. The museum mind is never a thinker, it's a curator. Preserves old danger, it displays old identity, it reenacts old emotional reflexes. Every hesitation I feel is an exhibit. Every fear I obey is a relic. Every reaction I repeat is inherited. These obedient habits hold me hostage because they make my nervous system loyal to yesterday's survival patterns instead of today's awareness. They convince me that instinct is risky, clarity and is dangerous, and sovereignty must wait for permission. They keep me bowing to memory instead of breathing from presence. Spirit frequency exposes the architecture. Sovereign clarity keeps the exhibits. Savage wisdom deletes the obedience. The moment I stop rehearsing the inherited nervous system caution, the hostage becomes the liberator and the liberated. The moment I breathe from instinct, The museum cracks. The moment I rise from awareness, the cage dissolves. 7 ways why my museum mind obedience holds me hostage. My museum mind is inherited obedience holds me hostage because it was built from fear logic I never chose. It carries ancestor reflexes, school-trained correctness, parent-approved caution, social role maintenance, and the emotional snapshots that pretend to be truth. It obeys everything old and resists everything now. It keeps me loyal to the version of myself that stopped, that no longer exists or are good for me. The museum mind is a curator of outdated identity. It preserves what once protected me. It repeats what once saved me. It reenacts what once defined me. But none of that belongs to my present awareness. Inherited obedience makes me bow to memories instead of sensing the nowality. It makes me react from yesterday instead of breathe from now to eternity. It convinces me that safety is repetition, that clarity must obey grammar, that instinct must wait for permission. Spirit frequency exposes the trap. As spirit sovereign clarity melts the exhibits. Savage wisdom deletes the obedience. The moment I stop rehearsing inherited caution, the hostage becomes the liberator of me, myself, and I to fly. The moment I breathe from instinct, the museum cracks. The moment I rise from awareness, destroys the cage, dissolves the ancestor obedience, education obedience, and PhD obedience, parent obedience, social obedience, self obedience, mind museum obedience, and emotional snapshot obedience. As I witness my sovereign lifestyle now and forevermore, I soar a spirit optimism. Why my inherited nervous system ego, ancestor obedience, why my inherited nervous system ego invented my mind, museum mind stubbornness. And it did a good job for me because I am a stubborn SOB sometimes. But I'm handsome to being stubborn. You know, you got to be handsome. You got to feel good, look good doing it. It doesn't do you any good, but it makes you laugh. That's the biggest thing, is make yourself laugh. Because your inherited nervous system, ego, treats obedience as the safest way to survive. Your lineage survived by obeying danger, hierarchy, and tribal rules. That reflex became ancestor obedience, parent obedience, and the biggest one it becomes is social obedience. The ego still thinks obedience equals protection, so it invents a whole museum of stay small, stay acceptable, and don't disrupt anything. This becomes a stubbornness, a frontier lockup, where inherited rules override instinct. Because your inherited nervous system ego turns education and PhD obedience into intellectual cages. Education obedience and PhD obedience become polished versions of the same survival reflex. Follow the system, earn approval, avoid mistakes. The museum mind freezes these academic patterns as identity exhibits. I must know, I must be right, I must prove myself. This becomes stubbornness, a jail where intellect becomes a barricade instead of a frontier. Because your inherited nervous system ego converts emotional snapshots into permanent truth. Where have you witnessed that in your life? I've witnessed that in my life in many, many places. But now that I'm awakened and aware, I can gently rise, shine, and fly away into my frontiers of freedom. Every childhood fear, humiliation, silence, or rejection becomes an emotional snapshot and obedient loops of yesterday's repetition that I live today. The museum mind preserves these moments as how life works, and the ego forces you to obey them. This becomes stubbornness, a cell where outdated emotions dictate present moment perceptions. Have you ever seen that in your life? That one's very, very alive in my life. But I'm learning to every questions rise me out of that. Why is this yesterday, and why is today trend-setting optimism? Because your inherited nervous system, ego, uses self-obedience to maintain control. Self-obedience is the ego's internal sheriff. That's why that guy's always in trouble with me. No, self-obedience is ego's internal sheriff, enforcing old rules even when no one else is watching. Don't feel that or don't sense that. Never say that. Don't rise yet. The museum mind stores these internal commands as identity artifacts, or artifallacies if you want. This becomes stubbornness, a frontier lockup where you police yourself with inherited limits. And that's the thing. The museum mind has inherited limits. Because your inherited nervous system, ego, fears freedom more than confident confinement. Freedom dissolves the familiar, and the ego hates that. So it invents the mind museum obedience. Rigid beliefs, fixed viewpoints, predictable reactions to keep you inside emotional territory it can control. This becomes stubbornness, a jail where you serve time for inherited fear instead of liberation from instinctual expansion. Why the nervous system invented my mind museum, society obedience, thinking, and knowing obedience. My nervous system invented my museum mind because it was trained to survive society long before it was trained to sense ferocity. It built obedient thinking and obedient knowing from ancestor fear logic. Why trained correctness, parent approved caution, cultural politeness, and emotional snapshots that throws me into roles I never consciously choose. What I call thinking is often just social obedience. What I call knowing is usually inherited compliance. Why is knowing inherited compliance? To socialize stuff, disguised as intelligence. The museum mind is a curator of societal expectations. It preserves the rules, it displays the roles, and reenacts the obedience. Society rewards repetition, never perception. It rewards politeness, never clarity. It rewards conformity, never sovereignty. My nervous system learned to obey before it learned to perceive. That is true. My nervous system learned to obey before it learned to perceive. It learned to fit in before it learned to sense. It learned to survive the room before it learned to inhabit itself. This is why my thoughts feel familiar instead of liberated, free, and sovereign. This is why my knowing feels rehearsed instead of authentic. This is why my clarity feels delayed instead of instinctive. Spirit frequency exposes the architecture. Sovereign awareness melts the exhibits. Savage wisdom deletes obedience. The moment I stop bowing to social invented thinking, I stop being held hostage by it. The moment I breathe from instinct, the moment the museum mind cracks. The moment I rise from awareness, the cage dissolves. Why my inherited nervous system ego invented my opinions, beliefs, and viewpoints, along with my mind museum stubbornness. Because your inherited nervous system serves as ego, uses opinions as emotional armor. Your lineage survived by forming quick judgments, fast conclusions, meant fast protection. That reflex passed forward, and now your ego invents opinions as shields. The museum mind freezes these opinions into rigid exhibits, forcing you to defend them even when they no longer match reality or nowality. This becomes stubbornness, a frontier lockup where opinions replace perception, because your inherited nervous system ego believes in identity cages. Beliefs aren't just ideas, they're inherited safety codes. Your ego clings to them because changing a belief feels like losing a piece of identity. The museum mind preserves these inherited beliefs as truth artifacts, and the ego forces you to obey them. This becomes stubbornness, a jail where your belief becomes bars instead of bridges. Because your inherited nervous system ego treats viewpoints as territory to defend. The ego fears uncertainty, so it invents viewpoints as emotional land claims. This is how it becomes a fort, a barricade, a sheriff's office. The museum mind stores these viewpoints as permanent exhibits, trapping you in reenactments instead of frontier awareness. This becomes stubbornness, a cell where you serve time for protecting mental territory instead of expanding into sovereign perception. Why indoctrinated education is museum mind limitations. Because indoctrinated education worships memorized obedience, never sovereign perception. Indoctrinated education trains the nervous system to repeat, recite, and conform. It rewards correct answers, never frontier awareness and curiosity. It builds museum mind exhibits of knowledge that are really just inherited vocabulary, ancestor approved thinking. How are we living today, ancestor approved thinking and knowing? This locks you into an intellectual obedience instead of an intellectual clarity. Because inherited education preserves identity instead of dissolving limitation. The system teaches you to be, how to behave, and what to believe, what to fear. It curates your identity like a museum artifact, polished, predictable, obedient. It never shows you how to sense, breathe, perceive beyond the cage of my museum mind limitations. As a result, life lived inside old frameworks instead of sovereign awareness. Why ancestor obedience is a museum mind jail a fail. Because ancestor obedience traps you inside yesterday's danger maps. Your ancestors survived by obeying fear, hierarchy, scarcity, and silence. Their nervous system learned obey or die. That reflex has been passed all the way to today. The museum mind preserves these old survival maps as permanent exhibits, making you react to modern life with ancient fear logic. This becomes a prison because you're living inside danger that no longer exists. Bowing to ghosts instead of sensing your frontier valor. Because ancestor obedience freezes your identity into inherited roles. The museum mind stores generational roles, the quiet one, the responsible one, the strong one. The obedient one enforces you to reenact them. These roles become emotional bars around your instinct. You end up performing your lineage instead of living your sovereignty. This is the prison, a life curated by the past instead of created by your present awareness. Why parent and community obedience is museum mind Huskow. Because parent obedience teaches you to shrink your instinct to fit the tribe. Parent obedience installs the first bars of the Huskow. You learn to mute your clarity so you don't disrupt their comfort. Their fears, their emotional rules, the museum mind preserves these inherited limits as good behavior, locking your instinct behind the generational caution. You end up living inside a small cell built from don't embarrass us and don't bear it yourself. Don't be too much and don't break the patterns or the rules of the fools. Because community obedience traps you in roles instead of raw perception. Community obedience adds the rest of the bars you're taught to perform the acceptable version of yourself. And the version of yourself is what other people want you to be. So you liberate you through raw, untamed voltage of yourself. The helpful one, the polite one, the predictable one. The museum mind stores these community expectations as identity exhibits, forcing you to react roles instead of breathe from instinct. This becomes the Huskow, a frontier lockup where you serve time for the tribe's comfort instead of your own sovereignty. Why insecurity obedience locks you into the museum mind Huskow of staying safe in yesterday. Because insecurity obedience makes you bow to fear instead of rise of veracity and authenticity. Insecurity on its own is just a nervous system echo, but insecurity obedience is when you treat that echo like a law you must obey. You follow the fear instead of the frontier. The museum mind stores every moment of hesitation as a lesson, turning old emotional snapshots into rules you must obey. The obedience becomes the Huskow, a frontier lockup where your instincts is handcuffed by the illusion you never chose. Because insecurity obedience traps you in self-minimizing roles. When insecurity becomes something you obey, you start performing the small version of yourself. The quiet ones, the careful one, the apologetic one, the museum mind preserves these roles as identity exhibits, forcing you to reenact them instead of breathe from sovereign perception. This is the Huskow, a jail built from self-doubt, where you serve time for stories that were never true. Why my inherited nervous system ego invents my thinking, knowing mind museum stubbornness. Because your inherited nervous system ego treats thinking as a shield against danger. Your lineage survived by overthinking threats, scanning the danger, and building mental barricades. That's why mental health is interesting. The reflex paths forward, and your ego now invents thinking as armor. The museum mind preserves these old mental defenses as truth exhibits, forcing you to rely on thought instead of instinct. This becomes stubbornness, a frontier lockup where thinking replaces sensing. Because your inherited nervous system ego confuses knowing with control. When your nervous system feels unsafe, the ego grabs onto certainty I know of. I'm right, I figured it out. Become the emotional handcuffs. The museum mind stores these rigid conclusions as identity, trapping you in reenactment instead of perception. This is stubborn knowing, Huskow, a jail where the ego uses knowledge to avoid vulnerability. Because your inherited nervous system ego fears humility more than confinement. Humility dissolves the ego's illusions of control, so it invents stubbornness to stay inside familiar mental territories. The museum mind freezes these inherited limits into how life works, forcing you to obey them even when they shrink your sovereignty. This becomes the Huskow, a cell where you serve time for inherited fear of being wrong instead of instinctual expansion. Why energized listening, maverick questions, destroy my inherited nervous system's ego, invented thinking, knowing mind museum stubbornness, because energized listening bypasses the ego state thinking loops. Energized listening doesn't listen to your thoughts, it listens to beneath them. It slips past the inherited nervous system ego that invented your thinking, knowing museum and goes straight to raw perception. The stubborn mind can never survive this. It loses its grip because energized listening refuses to obey old mental exhibits. It dissolves the ego's I already know reflex and replaces it with frontier clarity. Because maverick questions expose ego's fake and bake certainty. Maverick questions don't ask for information. They acquire the wisdom for liberation. They crack open the ego's museum of stubbornness by unveiling how much of your knowing is inherited, outdated, and fear-driven. Maverick questions destabilize the ego's sheriff office of certainty, forcing it to admit it's been inventing answers to feel safe. The moment the ego is exposed, its stubbornness collapses like a false frontier. Because the energized listening and maverick questions activate perception instead of performance. Your inherited nervous system ego invented a thinking, knowing persona to keep you predictable, energized. As energized listening and maverick questions destroy that persona by shifting, by rising you from performance to perception. They rise you out of the museum, out of the exhibits, and out of the reenactments, and out of the stubbornness, and drop you into living awareness. This is where the ego loses its power. It can't control a mind that's actually perceiving to rise you to your red carpet ride. And may your day, and thank you for listening, and may your day flow of forthright love and optimistic wisdom now and forevermore.